So I tried to put together a show with the minimum number of slides to provide a basic introduction. Unfortunately, it's still kind of long. I'll have to move a little bit quickly through some of them to get done in time, and I will try to watch the time. But you can get a copy of the slides afterwards in case I go a little bit too fast for you. Let me start off with the way that everybody is introduced to money. Whether you studied economics or not, I'm sure you got this story. I can remember when my daughter was in first grade, and she came to me and told me this story. And I said, well, actually, that's not quite right. She said, yes, it is, Daddy. This is what the teacher said. So you get it from a very young age. It begins with barter. We've got Robinson Crusoe. He's shipwrecked. He meets Friday. Crusoe knows how to grow grain. Friday knows how to fish, so they barter. But this can be very inconvenient because it requires that on the day that Friday wants to deliver a fish, Crusoe actually wants a fish and he's willing to trade grain for it. So the story is that it requires a double coincidence of wants. So it's inconvenient. They search around for something to act as a medium of exchange. They might begin with seashells, but through some evolutionary process, they end up with gold, which has some nice characteristics that make it a very good medium of exchange. It's very valuable, it doesn't rot, and on and on and on. So this greatly reduces the transactions costs involved in barter. There is one problem with gold. It is extremely valuable. You got to worry about people who will try to take away your gold stock. So you start storing it with the goldsmiths. The goldsmiths already had that problem. They had to protect the gold stock that they're using to make jewelry. They have safes and so on, and so you would deposit your gold with the goldsmith. The goldsmith gives you a receipt. People discover that they actually can use those receipts in payments rather than using the gold, because individuals who accept them know that they can go get the gold out of the goldsmith's safe whenever they want. The goldsmith, in turn, realizes that he actually doesn't have to keep the gold in the safe. He only needs to keep a little bit because those receipts are not all going to come back on the same day. Okay, so he discovers what we now call the deposit expansion process. He can issue lots of receipts and hold just a little bit of gold, maybe 10%, for safekeeping to redeem on demand. Those goldsmiths become the banks. So that's the story. In the conventional approach, the money supply is exogenous. I'm getting into a little higher level of analysis now. This is what you would get in your money and banking textbook. That has a multiplier because you only have to keep 10% of reserves for withdrawals and for clearing with other banks on hand. So we get a money multiplier. The idea is that the central bank that issues the reserve can control the quantity of money that's created by controlling the quantity of reserves that they supply. So there was a belief for a very long time, really pushed by Milton Friedman and other monetarists, that central banks can and should control the rate of growth of money supply in order to control inflation. And so for a long time, the idea was we will target money supply. Really nobody who understands how banks and central banks operate believes that anymore. All the major central banks around the world have moved away from money targeting toward interest rate targeting, but the goal is still the same. The idea is that the central bank, because it is the issuer of reserves, can control the price of the reserves that it issues and thereby control the interest rates, and that allows it to continue to fight inflation even though it's recognized they can't control the money supply. Okay, what is money in this view? I want to say something about the nature of money, and I'm going to contrast it with the MMT view. Money comes about to lubricate the market. It's more efficient than barter. Specific money-denominated assets fulfill that function, medium of exchange. Exactly which kinds of things fulfill that function, changes over time. For a very long time, it supposedly was gold, okay, but gradually we have changed those money things that fulfill that function. But still today, the focus is on money as a medium of exchange. There are other functions that money serves, but those derive from the medium of exchange function. So medium of exchange is the most important function of money. Continuing on in the textbooks, so in every macroeconomics textbook, within the first 2 or 3 chapters, you're going to get a picture like this one, the circular flow diagram. Okay, and this is focusing on the use of money as a medium of exchange in something like a real capitalist economy. The firms hire the factor services. They need to pay wages to households. The households use those wages to buy the output of the firms. So the money moves in a flow between households and firms in this very simple economy. If you think about it for a minute, and if you ever asked your teacher, where did the firms get the money that they use to pay the wages to the household? They say, oh, well, the firms use the money that they get when the households buy the consumer goods that the firms produce. Say, oh, okay, where did the households get the money? Well, they got it from the firms that paid their wages. You can see that this is a circular argument with an infinite regress. There is no story of how the money got into the economy, okay? You finally move on to somewhere around chapter 9, where you start studying money and banking in your macro textbook. And they put financial institutions into the circular flow. Now this one is more complicated because we also have the government, we have the foreign sector, and so on. But the point is that now we've got banks in the story. The banks lend to firms which use the loans to invest, okay? The payments go to the workers in the investment goods sector that are producing the investment goods. They can use that money to either save or to consume. Their savings in the banks gets lent out to the firms to finance their investment. So the banks are intermediaries between savers and investors. So you ask the question, where did the money come from? Well, the banks got it from the savers so that they can lend it to the firms. Where did the households get the money? Well, they got it from the firms who were spending on production of the investment goods. It's the same infinite regress, the same circular flow, okay? Circular argument. There is really no story of how the money got into the economy. Okay, what is wrong with this orthodox story? I know that I am being very quick explaining the dominant paradigm on money and banking. But what's wrong with it? First, there's actually no evidence of barter-based markets. And I don't know if any of you have read David Graeber's book. This was just a fantastic success, an unimaginable success. Debt the first 5,000 years. Everybody bought this book. Okay, it was a runaway bestseller. It's like 5,000 pages long. It's the kind of book everybody buys and probably hardly anybody reads, including me. I've got it on my shelf. Maybe when I retire, I'll finally get the time to read it. Okay, but what David shows is that when we look around the world, as far back as we go, you just do not find any economies anywhere based on barter. They just do not exist, okay? And what we actually find when we look at history, and I knew this long before Graeber, is that money actually pre-exists markets. Money was not invented as a transactions cost minimizing device for markets that already existed. Money pre-exists markets. Okay, money is as old as writing. How do we know that? The very first written records are all about money. Okay, basically, Writing was not invented by poets. It was invented by accountants to keep track of money values. All right? So money exists before markets, so there's something wrong with that part of the story. And even the Austrians, who pushed for a very long time this barter story, they now admit that once you get beyond about 10 people and 10 different commodities, it's very hard for market higgling and haggling to settle on a single commodity that will serve as money. If you're talking about many commodities and many people involved, unless you add modern computing power, you're not going to select a single commodity to serve as your money commodity. And finally, from the very beginning, the evidence shows that authorities were always involved in the monetary system, in creating the monies of account. I'll come back to that. So authorities were always there. It wasn't Robinson Crusoe and Friday that invented money. It came out of the authorities. Another problem with the story is modern money has no intrinsic value. This is a little bit hard to explain when your whole story was about choosing a commodity that was very valuable that could serve as your money commodity. Okay? Today's monies are not attached to any commodities. They have no intrinsic values. And neither did ancient money, in spite of the goldsmith story. As far back as you go, the money things did not have intrinsic values, usually. Okay. There's an infinite regress problem. What people will do then is they say, well, yes, in the past it was gold that gave money value, but today it is trust. They ask them, well, what is the trust in the money? They say, well, I trust that Billy Bob will take it from me in payment. I trust I can go to the grocery store and someone will take it. Okay? In my view, that's a very thin argument to base the most important institution we have in modern economies, which is money, on trust. And also, there is no circular flow that can explain where the money comes from. How does it get into the economy? So I'm going to present an alternative. This is sort of a summary of the topics that I'll cover. Origins and nature, the role of the state, the role of taxes, what sovereign currencies are all about, and what that has to do with fiscal policy. Okay, if you look at what archaeology has found and what anthropologists have found, we can start with this one. So this is 50,000 years old. This was some kind of humans. And if you can see it from your seat, they have put scratch marks in there. It's a rock. They put scratch marks in that. So archaeologists have dug this up and they can date it. Okay? What is it? We don't know. They're keeping track of something. We don't know what it is. Over here, sorry, this was 500,000 years. 50,000 years. Those bones, harder for you to see from the seat, but you can look at it later. Much more complicated scratch marks on it. Keeping track of something 50,000 years ago. What are they keeping track of? We don't know. Okay, it's dug out of the ground. They didn't leave a written record because there was no writing. Clay balls, which are gradually transformed into the cuneiform tablets. What are those? Okay, 5,000 years. We know. We can read them. It's all about money and debts. It's keeping track of money and debts. Okay, we can read those things. What are these? Does anyone know? They're made of wood. They are tally sticks. Tally sticks. We still use the terms stock and stub. Tally sticks were hazelwood sticks that put the hash marks that look an awful lot like the bones that are 50,000 years old. Okay. These were used in Europe until 1919. Tally sticks, hash marks in them, split into stock and stub. This is how most European kings spent. They spent tally sticks. They didn't spend coins. They spent tally sticks. The majority of their spending and the majority of their tax revenue was in the form of tally sticks. Why did you split them? To stop counterfeiters. When you paid your taxes, they had to literally match the stock and stub to make sure you didn't cut a few more hash marks. We still use the terms. What's a score? Fourscore and 7 years ago. Score, it's 20 pounds. It was a thick cut in the stick. That's a score. Raise a tally. All the Americans have heard that term. Raise a tally. Okay? It means go out and cut some tally sticks off the trees. That's how the king raised revenue. Okay? So, where did money come from? We do not know, and we will not know. Nobody sat down and wrote a memo, today I invented money and this is how I did it. We're not going to find that. Because money pre-existed writing. As I said, the first writing already is talking about money. So we're not going to know. We have to speculate. The most convincing speculating I've ever seen is done by the most famous coin collector in the world, beyond collecting, studied coins, was a guy named Philip Grierson at University of Cambridge in England. When he died, he donated all the coins, which were worth a fortune, to the University of Cambridge. He speculated that actually money came out of the ancient tribal practice that's called Wehrgeld. Now that was applied to the Germans. Roman society was civilized. Germany was still a tribal society. The Romans studied the German tribal society, so we know a lot about how it functioned. But anthropologists find that every tribal society they come across also has this Wehrgeld tradition. If you cause an injury to someone else, okay, here, whoops, killed the guy, a fine is imposed on you. And you have to pay a fine to the victim's family. Okay? These fines were in kind. It would depend on what the injury was. That would determine what you had to pay, whether it's a goat or a cow or a horse or sheep or chicken. Oh, as far back as there was tribal society and humans came out of tribal society, so it's as old as humans. Okay, when did they come up with the idea and why did they come up with it? We don't know when, but it's obvious why they did it. To stop blood feuds. Otherwise you have the Hatfields and the McCoys killing each other. So this is to stop retribution. You had to pay a fine. So Grierson's notion was that the concept of valuing things came out of the Wehrgeld tradition. It was a huge jump because Wehrgeld, you pay a cow versus a chicken, depending on the damages you had done. Money allows you to compare those things. Oh, it takes 100 chickens value to equal 1 cow. He thinks that's where money came from. It's a big intellectual jump, bigger than any measuring jump we had ever done before, because the measurements before money always were length. What's the length? Foot. Whose foot? The king's foot. Okay? Or cubit and so on. Those are relatively easy. Now, a hint is that every ancient money unit was the name of a grain weight unit. Shekel, lira, pound, those are all weight units. They all came out of measuring grain. So someone had the idea, let's use the grain measurement in order to measure the value of everything. By Babylonian times, this is exactly what they did, and then the price list, the equivalents to the mina, which was a grain weight unit, was posted at the temple. That is how you knew the value of everything. It was set by the temple's authorities. I'll come back to religion because it's important for money. Okay, alternative, what is money?
Did you define money?
Yeah, I will. It is a state monopoly. It is a social unit of measurement. If you're in America, you can point to anything, you can ask people, what is that worth? They're not going to tell you in terms of chickens. They're going to tell you in terms of dollars. Almost everything can be valued in terms of dollars. Now, not quite everything, but as capitalism develops, a greater and greater range of things are measured in terms of money. It is a state money of account. Almost without exception, the money unit of account that we use comes from the state. Every time a new country is formed, it chooses its own money of account. Why did we get the dollar in the US? Because we didn't want the pound. Okay? We just revolted. We chose the dollar, and we modeled our currency after the Spanish currency to thumb our noses at England. Right? And then we have money records. There's a hierarchy of these IOUs denominated in the state money of account. There is bank money, okay, and there are your IOUs. They're all denominated in the US dollar in America. The form that they take depends on technology. I'll come back to this. Paper money, coin money, electronic money, that is just the technological way of recording. The tally sticks, it might seem like that's a pretty primitive technology, but actually the tally sticks were a very advanced technology. It was hard to counterfeit. The problem with early coins and early paper money was counterfeiting wasn't all that hard to do. Counterfeiting was a tremendous problem when paper money started to be used. Okay? A lot of the technological advance is to reduce counterfeiting. What backs up our money today? When I first started teaching, the majority of the students in the class would say gold. Now this was in the early 80s. Okay? We had gone off gold under Richard Nixon. So it was already a decade that we had completely abandoned gold. It wasn't true then. Today, students rarely raise their hand because they all listen to Ron Paul, who wants to go back to gold, and they know that we're not on gold. Okay, so now it's very obvious. So I like to take the notes out and read what it says on the note. Okay, and probably you've all seen this on dollar bills. It says this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. Canadian dollar, Australian dollar. Okay, they all say virtually the same thing, so a lot of people say, oh, it's legal tender laws. But you know that that's false. Okay, when it says it's legal tender for all debts, public and private, many times your cash is refused. They say, no, we don't take cash, right? So it's just not true. And there are plenty of currencies that never had legal tender laws. What does the British pound say? Well, they don't have pound notes, so you have to look at a 5 pound. This is a picture of the Queen, and this is what she's telling you. I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of 5 pounds. What does that mean? You take a 5 pound note to the Queen, she will give you a 5 pound note. That's what it means. It's 5 pounds. Okay? That's all it says. The older people will remember who this is. Okay. Alternative. The use of the currency and value of money are based on the power of the issuing authority, not on the intrinsic value. Okay? The currency does not have to have any intrinsic value. It's based on the power of the issuing authority. The currency itself is a record of debts, whether it's printed on paper or stamped on a coin. It's a record of a debt. It is a promise to redeem, and I'll say more about what redemption means. The state played the central role in the evolution of money from the very beginning. It always has played the central role. What we typically find when we look around the world today and we look back as far back as we can go, about 5,000 to 6,000 years into the past, what we find is the one state or one nation, one currency rule. Each nation or state has its own currency. When the Soviet Union falls apart, every one of the former members chooses its own currency. Okay? In the past, the exceptions to this rule were extremely small and virtually irrelevant. The Vatican State used the Italian lira. Okay? That was an exception, minor. The only major exception to this rule is Euroland. It was an experiment in an exception, and it's been disastrous. Okay? Before the euro, this is what we find. It's not a coincidence. It's tied up with sovereign power, political independence, and fiscal authority. This is why every new nation adopts its own currency. And finally, taxes drive money. Taxes are what gives value its money. It is the power to impose taxes that is the important sovereign power that ensures the currency has value. I'll say more about this too. Okay, you don't have to take my word for it. You can take the written records at the time. Okay, let's look at the colony of Virginia. The colonies were not allowed to coin. The colonies had to use the crown's coins. Okay, the colonies were always short of money in order to hire the armies to fight the Indians and the French Canadians. So they started issuing paper monies, okay? Paper money was created and directly spent by the legislature. Every paper money included a new tax. Okay. So when they passed a law to authorize printing 10,000 pounds, Virginia pounds, they also imposed a tax that they expected would raise 10,000 pounds. They imposed the tax the same time that they issued the notes. Now, why would they impose a tax? Because it created a demand for those notes. The colonial regular people had severe shortage of coins too. They couldn't have paid the new tax with the coins. There's not enough. Now, they were allowed to pay taxes with coins. Of course, the Virginia colonial government was glad to have the coins, okay? But they typically paid most of the tax in the form of notes. When the colonial legislature received the tax revenue, what did they do with it? They burned it. They did not spend their tax revenue. They burned it. So as the notes come in, they burn them. What did the King of England do when the tally sticks came in tax payments? Burned them. You always burn your tax revenue. You do not spend tax revenue, you burn it. In fact, they finally outlawed the use of tally sticks in England in around 1840. All the tally sticks were brought in, and the people at the Exchequer, which is the Treasury, the IRS, they were so glad they didn't have to use tally sticks anymore, matching them. They threw them all into the stoves at the same time, and they burned down Parliament. There's a very famous painting of Parliament burning down. It's because they burned the tally sticks. Okay, anyway. So anyway, the revenues received were burned. The notes that were not received remained out and were used in the markets and actually were preferred over the coins. People preferred to use the notes rather than the coins. Okay, the taxes were paid in notes or specie. About 3/4 of the taxes were paid with notes and 1/4 were paid with the coins. This tax that was imposed by the legislature when they issued the notes was called a redemption tax. It was called a redemption tax. Okay, that's written right into the law. They knew what they were doing. The purpose of the tax is to redeem the notes. It gives a demand for the notes, and then the notes are brought back and burned. That prevents them from causing inflation. The purpose of the tax was to get most of the notes out so there wouldn't be any inflation. Adam Smith, 1776, wrote about this. He said, you know, there's this strange thing going on in the colonies. They're issuing paper money, but it retains its value as long as they don't issue too much of it. Okay? So you use the taxes to make sure they don't stay out there and cause inflation. Another example. This one's a little bit different. Okay? This is the Yap Islands. And economists use this as an example all the time of primitive people using money that is a commodity. So they decided to use these stone wheels as money to reduce the transactions costs of barter. Nobody's laughing. Here's how tall they are. Here's their coin. Okay? When you want to go to the market to buy a fat pig, you have to get 10 strong guys. You put a log through here, you pick it up, and you carry it to the market and you buy a pig. That reduced the transactions costs. Okay? It turns out on the Yap Islands, they don't have any stones like this. They have to get their dugout canoes, they paddle across open ocean 200 miles to go get the stone. They carve it, they put it on the canoe, and they try to paddle back. And a lot of the stones, the canoe flips over and they end up on the bottom of the ocean. But when the Yap Islanders consider their wealth of stones, they include all the ones that fell on the bottom because it doesn't matter. They know they still have them. I mean, they don't have them on the island, but they know where they are, more or less. They can't get them, but it doesn't matter. Okay? So anyway, economists wrote this up as, this is primitive money. Okay? They don't tell you the second part of the story. So the Germans are trying to colonize the Yap Islands. The Germans want some roads built. So they go to the island, you know, and they say, hey, we need the road built. We'll pay you currency to build the road. And I don't know what the German currency then was, but let's say it's the mark. You know, we'll pay you 5 marks an hour to build the road. The Yap Islanders look at them like they're crazy. Say, you want me to work for pieces of paper? And of course, the Germans look at them like they're crazy. You guys are so lazy, you won't even work for money. Okay? So they wouldn't work for the German currency. So some bright colonial governor said, I know what we'll do. Go through with a can of black paint and paint a big X on about half of the stones. So that's what they did. So they go through, they paint a black X. And the islanders say, what's going on? I say, well, we tax those. Okay, those are ours now. And they say, how can we get them back? I say, well, you can build a road. So they reversed the sequence, but the tax turned these into money. They were not money before. They were what we call primitive valuables. All tribal society has primitive valuables. They're usually things that are completely useless, and that's on purpose. And then they attach great ceremonial value to them. Okay? So this is a typical tribal thing that Europeans could not conceive of, so they thought they must be money. But they were turned into money only by a tax that the colonial government put on them. Okay? Again, you don't have to believe me. Here is Beardsley Ruml. I'm not going to read the whole quote. Beardsley Ruml was an extremely important person. He was the chairman of the New York Fed. The New York Fed used to be called chairman, not president. Okay, that was to indicate how he was more important than the chairman of the Fed. Okay, still is, but we pretend like it's Janet Yellen. Okay, so anyway, he writes an article at the end of the war, and the title of the article is Taxes for Revenue is Obsolete. We do not need taxes for revenue. We need them for other purposes. We need them to fight inflation. We need them to change people's behavior, so we tax cigarettes and so on. We don't need them for revenue purposes. He says, that is what the war taught us and the people. Okay, how did it teach us that? We were running budget deficits of 25% of GDP with no negative impacts on the economy at all. Okay? Here's an exchange between the head of the Fed, so this one is the chairman of the Fed, and Wright Packman, who was an important representative. During the war, the Fed bought lots of government bonds to keep the interest rate near zero. Okay? And so here's Packman. How did the government, how did you, the Fed, get the money to buy those $2 billion of government securities? $2 billion sounds like little now, but it was a lot back then. We created it. Out of what? Out of the right to issue money credit. And there's nothing behind it except the government's credit? Well, we have the government bonds. That's right, that's government's credit. In other words, the only thing you have is another government debt. Okay? So we've created money that is a government debt, and all that stands behind it is another government debt. So they go on. Packman, do you believe that people should pay their debts generally when they can? I think it depends a good deal upon the individual. But of course, if there were no debt in our money system, there wouldn't be any money. Whoops, sorry, I forgot to show you. There wouldn't be any money. Mr. Packman, suppose everybody paid their debts. Would we have any money to do business on? Okay, and of course the answer is no. If everybody repaid their debt, there would be no money. Mr. Eccles says, he sees what direction he's going. He says, that's correct. In other words, our system is based entirely on debt. Okay? Yes, it is. Or finally, here's Bernanke. The Fed lent and spent about $34 trillion to save Wall Street. $34 trillion. So he's interviewed on 60 Minutes. Is that tax money the Fed is spending? You notice it's virtually identical to what was asked at the end of World War II. It's not tax money. We simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account. If they have somebody at the Fed who has a finger, that is how they do it. Keystrokes. It's just keystrokes. That's how you do it. Okay. How are we doing? I think I'm going to skip over some history of thought here. Implications. Fiat money is not worthless. It's valuable due to the state's promise to redeem it in payments to the state. You can find this in the economic literature. The very best place to start is with A. Mitchell Innes, who was the Queen's ambassador to Washington. He was an autodidactic. He wrote something on beekeeping, and then he wrote the 2 best articles ever written on money. Okay? How he figured it out, I have no idea. Keynes reviewed it and said, we might quibble with some of the details, but the argument is sound. Okay? Money and debt are linked. Debts are denominated in the state money of account. My professor Minsky used to always say, anybody can create money, the problem is to get it accepted. Creating money is a matter of writing, I owe you $5. Your problem is to get somebody to accept that. Now, banks have an easy time, you have a harder time. All monies are created as liabilities of the issuers, and here's the key point that Innes makes. All issuers must accept their own liabilities back in payment. If you refuse to accept it, you have defaulted. Why was the Bank of England created? The king defaulted on his tally sticks. One of the King Georges, I don't remember which number. He defaulted on his tally sticks. So they had to create the Bank of England because nobody trusted that king anymore. Okay? He refused to accept back his own tally sticks in payment. All money is credit money. The state money approach might appear to be inconsistent with the credit money approach, but even state money is credit money. The state's money is the government's debt, the government's IOU, and they must accept it back in payment. Redemption then means delivering an IOU in payment to its issuer. All right? It doesn't matter whether the IOU is printed on a gold coin or printed on paper. It's an IOU. Okay? It doesn't need to have any intrinsic value or not, but even if it does, it is still an IOU. So sovereignty is a set of institutions. There are many other aspects of sovereignty, but the important one for money is that the sovereign has the power to impose fees, fines, taxes, and to name what it will accept in payment of those obligations to the state. When the fees, fines, and taxes are paid, the currency is redeemed. It's accepted back by the sovereign issuer. Some sovereigns also agree to redeem their IOUs for gold when you're on a gold standard, but that's not necessary. Now, we know it's not necessary, okay, because we gave it up a long time ago. Skip the rest of that. So, in almost all religions, debt is a sin, but being a creditor is an equal sin. Okay? So you're sinful on either side of the equation. The debts are paid by delivering back an IOU to the issuers. That is what we call redemption. These terms, of course, came from religion because money came out of the temples. So it's not a coincidence that many of the terms we use when we talk about money are terms we use when we talk about religion. So you can read this slide on your own. Which comes first, creation or redemption? Okay. You've got to create first before you can redeem. If you aren't in debt, you can't redeem yourself. Redemption can't come first. Debt has to come first. Government has to spend first, which is getting the government itself in debt, before the government can redeem itself, collect back in taxes. The colonial governments had to spend the notes before they can collect them. They have to be in sinful debt before they can be redeemed. This is true for everybody. Government, bank, household. You can't redeem your debts until you have created the debts. So how does the government really spend? Okay? Things are more complicated than they used to be. Our government does not spend paper money into existence. The paper money is issued only because you go to an ATM machine and make withdrawals. Our government doesn't spend the way that governments always had spent in the past. Why? Because there are two things in between you and the government. One is your bank, and the other is the government's bank, which we call the central bank. Okay? So you are, 3 degrees of separation away from the government. The government imposes a tax on you, but you pay taxes by writing a check or an electronic deduction from your bank account. The central bank deducts your bank's reserves and credits the Treasury's account at the central bank. When the Treasury wants to spend, it cuts a check. Okay? When you deposit it in your bank credits your account, sends the check on to the Fed credits your bank's reserves, and then debits the Treasury's account at the central bank. Okay? So it's more complicated, and it's more complicated than that, because we have a whole bunch of what are called tax and loan accounts and special depositories and so on and so on and so on, that complicates the procedures and makes it a lot harder to see how things actually work. But the logic remains, it's still the same. You can't deduct reserves from banks unless they have them. They can only get them from the government. So the government either has to spend or lend the reserves before the banks can have their reserves debited when you make your tax payments. All the logic remains. One of the first things that MMT did was to get into the details of how everything operates today, which I can tell you no economist knew. None. Before we looked into it. Now, of course, there were people at the Treasury and the Fed who knew because they had to do it. Okay, but academic economists had no idea how the government really spends. So some of our earliest articles 20 years ago were, How does the government really spend? So we have gone through all the details, and we've done it for other countries too. And it's the same. Okay, I mean, minor detail changes, but otherwise it's the same. Policy implications. Government cannot go bankrupt in its own currency. It can issue more through keystrokes. It can make all payments on government bonds through keystrokes. Okay? You don't take that money away from taxpayers, as Bernanke explained. How did they spend and lend $34 trillion to save Wall Street? It was all keystrokes. There is no limit. The government can always afford to buy anything for sale. If there are unemployed people around, the government can always afford to get them jobs and pay their wages. The only economic constraints government faces are full employment of resources. Once you've employed all of them, okay, except for imports, the resources are already all used. And any further spending will be inflationary. Okay? So full employment and then an inflation constraint. Other constraints are political. So, during the global financial crisis, Obama comes in, okay, and things are getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And Obama wanted to spend more. Okay, we finally got a fiscal stimulus package of $800 billion, which was $400 billion spread over 2 years. Okay, $400 billion and then $400 billion. Any economist who studied the economy, other than extremely ideological ones, knew that wasn't enough. Obama knew it wasn't enough. So he goes on TV and what does he say? We're out of money. We would like to do more, but we ran out. Okay? We're on an unsustainable debt path. Okay, this is what many economists were claiming. We got to borrow from the Chinese. We ran out of money, so we got to get the dollars from Beijing, which is ridiculous if you think about it. All dollars came from the United States. We'll become Weimar or Zimbabwe, hyperinflation. Look at Euroland, that could happen to us. We'll be just like the next Greece. Okay? Burden our grandkids, all this stuff. All of this is false. It's absolutely false. Okay? None of this could possibly happen. Paul Samuelson, who was the most important textbook writer for your grandparents, was interviewed in 1974. It's a very interesting interview. You can find it on the web, interviewed by Mark Blaug. He says, I think there's an element of truth in the superstition that the budget must be balanced. Here he said at all times, but later in the interview, he's talking about balancing the budget over the cycle. And he says, it's like the old-fashioned religion was to scare people by sometimes what might be regarded as myths. So the purpose of these kinds of statements is to scare you. That is the purpose. It's not true. It's a superstition. It's like old-time religion. We know it's not true. But economists, are in the business of dishonesty. Because we got to scare you. Okay? This is Paul Samuelson, who's the greatest, according to many, greatest economist. Here's the St. Louis Fed. The St. Louis Fed is the second most conservative Fed in the United States. It's the home of Milton Friedman's monetarism. Here's the St. Louis Fed. I won't read it all. You can read the quote. And what they say is the government can never run out of dollars. It can never be forced to default. It can never be forced to miss a payment. It is actually never subject to the whims of bond vigilantes. All of that is false. This is the St. Louis Fed. Greenspan said the same thing. When he was asked, will Social Security really go broke? He said, no, of course not. The government has this thing called a printing press. Okay, we don't use a printing press. He should have said, we have this thing called the computer. And it has keys on it. We can't run out. King of France. I'm afraid I'm going to have to skip the sectoral balancing, which is very interesting, but let me conclude. So there are two views on the origins, the origins of money story that you adopt tells you what you think the nature of money is. Okay? Do the orthodox economists really believe Robinson Crusoe's story? Probably not. They tell that story because it focuses your attention on what they want you to focus your attention on. The idea of markets and money as a medium of exchange, okay? The alternative to that is a social relations story, variegated debt, role of the authorities, choosing a money of account, the state money, the currency, and taxes drive money. Again, the story of the origins, we don't know this, the truth, okay? But Variegated focuses your attention on debt, okay? It's in the nature of money that it must be debt. There's a movement now called debt-free money. It's a non sequitur. It's impossible. Money is debt. Bitcoins are not money. Can't be money. Money is not primarily a medium of exchange. Money is a state monopoly, unit of account, driven by obligations to the state. Typically now it's taxes. Banks make payments for their customers in bank IOUs that are denominated in the state's money. Deficit spending creates financial wealth. That's the part I didn't get to do, the sectoral balance approach. And a sovereign cannot run out of its own IOUs. So I'll stop there and hope we have time for questions.
What is modern monetary theory? You cannot take part in discussion about economics these days without hearing the term modern monetary theory come up. And it's important to understand what it is, because a great deal that is said about MMT, as I will refer to it throughout this video, is complete nonsense. Some of its supporters don't help MMT by making claims about it, which are frankly entirely unfounded and even untrue. And almost everything that is said about it by its opponents is, let's be honest, largely a work of fiction, because they want to, for reasons that are not apparent to me, deny the truth implicit within it. There is, in fact, very little about MMT that is either very radical, new, or unusual. It is simply a description of the way in which money is created and used by central government in a modern fiat currency economy. Now, I am aware that I've already used a number of terms that are quite complicated. For example, how money is used. We must remember that money is debt, and debt is created by bank lending. We must also remember that fiat currency is not backed by any form of asset. It is not linked to gold or silver or anything else. It is simply a government promise to pay that gives a fiat currency its value. And what we're talking about is how money of that type is created by the government and how that money created by the government functions within the economy of which we're all a part. Most of the time, most of economics tries to ignore this issue. It pretends, in many cases, that money hardly exists, which is quite absurd, because, of course, money does not only exist, but the existence of money and the management of money is a major part of the management of the economy. So, to have a theory which explains how money works is really important, and that's what MMT does, and that is why I think it is core to the understanding of macroeconomics. So having said all that as a preamble, let's talk about how this thing works. MMT says that a government that has its own central bank and its own currency, which in a country like the United Kingdom would be the Bank of England and the pound sterling, and with that currency being internationally acceptable, which we know the pound sterling is, then that government need neither tax nor borrow before spending, because its entire government expenditure can be funded by new money creation by its central bank acting on its behalf, with the government then being indebted to its central bank for the sum that it's expended. Let me put that another way. The government can simply tell its central bank, please make a payment to whoever the government wishes, and the central bank is required to mark up the government's overdraft to make the payment, and there does not need to be any money there to allow the payment to take place, because the mere process of increasing the overdraft does in itself create the money that the government wants to spend into the economy. And that is the core idea at the heart of MMT. Now, a government that borrows in this way from its own central bank need never repay the debt it owes to that central bank for one very good reason. And that is because it owns the bank in question, and therefore the bank in question has no effective claim against the government. But there's a much better reason why it need not make the repayment of at least some of that money which has been created. Because the money made in that way then becomes the money supply of the jurisdiction for which the government is responsible. And one of the ways in which we can even identify that a jurisdiction or state exists is that a government is able to put into place in that geographic location the currency that it declares to be legal tender. So, of course, it has to make sure that if it's declared a currency to be legal tender, there must be enough of it available. And by the process of spending money into existence to support its programs, hopefully mandated by a democratic election, then a government can create the money supply that allows that economy to undertake the transactions which will sustain it. So it does not have to repay all that debt, and this is a critical point to understand. That said, it cannot obviously not clear some of that debt. The reason why is that if you kept on making new currency forever, you would end up with hyperinflation. That obviously is totally unwise, and modern monetary theory, MMT, clearly understands that fact. And so it says there is one fundamental tool that exists to make sure that the government can control inflation. Anybody who says that MMT is not interested in inflation has clearly missed the point about the theory. Because in fact, MMT is obsessed by inflation and how to control it. But what it says is that the major control instrument that we have to stop inflation occurring is taxation. Because tax takes the money that the government has created as a result of it spending it into existence and brings it back into the central treasury where it is cancelled. If you look at a banknote, it says on it, "I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £5 or whatever." That promise is fulfilled by accepting that note in settlement of your tax liability. When the tax liability is paid, it is finished, it is complete, it is cancelled. You haven't got another liability. So the fact is that paying tax cancels your liability to the government, and in exactly the same way as repayment of a bank loan cancels the money that was created when a bank loan was advanced, so paying tax cancels the money that the government has put into existence by reason of its spending. This is fundamental to the understanding of MMT. The primary tool for the control of inflation is not the interest rate, which you would believe if you listened to neoclassical economics and neoliberal economics and its belief in the use of interest rates through independent central banks to achieve this role. Instead, taxation is the fundamental tool to control inflation, and therefore fiscal policy is primary in modern monetary theory. The secondary role of tax in the government's funding cycle is to provide the government-created money of a jurisdiction with value in exchange. Now, this is a little more complicated to understand, but let's be honest, if you were given a £5 note and you had no idea what it was, or you were in Fiji at the time with no opportunity to exchange it into local currency, then that £5 note would, for all practical purposes, be entirely worthless to you. But if you're in the UK, that £5 note, which would be worthless somewhere else, does have value, and the value is created by the fact that the government will accept your money in exchange for tax liabilities owing. Now, in the UK at present, well over a third of most people's income is in some way or other going to eventually be paid in tax. It won't all be paid in income tax, some will be paid in national insurance, some will be paid in VAT, some in alcohol duties or tobacco duties or car duties or road fund licenses or whatever else it might be. But ultimately, significant amounts of money are going to be paid in tax. And because trade gives rise to tax liabilities, those undertaking trade in the UK will always use the pound as their chosen instrument for trading because they don't want to take the exchange risk of waiting with dollars or whatever it might be to not know what those dollars or whatever else they might be will be worth on the day when they have to pay their tax, and therefore they will trade using pounds because that way they minimize their exchange risk. But that means that by requiring that tax be paid, the government forces its currency into use in the economy so that people use it. As a corollary, the government gets control of the economy by having management of the currency. This is fundamental to macroeconomic control of an economy by a government, and MMT is the only economic theory that really has an explanation of how that value is created. Once those roles of tax have been fulfilled, then tax can have other roles. It can, for example, deliver economic, social, regulatory, and inequality agendas on behalf of the government. And that is something that every government around the world usually wants to undertake. They wish to promote some activities, they wish to discourage others, and tax is incredibly useful for that. But what I stress is that that is a further role of tax which has nothing to do with revenue raising. It has everything to do with supporting other government agendas, which is a quite different objective. And this has to be fully understood. But it does make tax one of the most powerful instruments for delivering policy by any government anywhere. And in my opinion, MMT explains this. So what else does MMT say? Most importantly, what it says is that if the situation that I have described exists, then the government does not need to balance its income and expenditure. In fact, what it also says that in most situations, that balance would be thoroughly undesirable. For example, if the government has a growing economy, a modest but controlled inflation, then the expansion of its money supply is essential. And that expansion of the money supply is best delivered by running government deficits. It follows, like night does day, that this is what a government should do to make sure there is sufficient money in existence to let the economy grow. But that shortfall is not something that creates a risk to the economy as a whole. In fact, it is essential to ensure that there is cash in existence. What is more, there is no reason why the government then has to borrow any money back. It could just run an overdraft at the Bank of England or whatever its central bank might be if we're talking about another country, and that would meet the purpose just as well. In other words, a government in this situation never needs to borrow from financial markets. That is because a government of this sort can always borrow instead from its central bank. It has no dependency on financial markets as a consequence. For anyone to pretend that there is such a dependency is claiming a falsehood. It does not exist. And we know it doesn't. In the case of the UK, when we faced crises in 2008-9 and in 2020-21, the government created hundreds of billions of pounds of new cash to meet its own needs. It did it by effectively borrowing from its own central bank using the quantitative easing process, which does end up with this situation arising. And it did not need to go to the financial markets to say, please fund furlough or whatever else it might have been. That didn't happen. The government does not need to borrow from financial markets. But having said that, the government might well wish to offer a savings facility to banks and to other financial institutions within the jurisdiction who wish to save with the safest institution that is available within the country as a whole, and that is the government. The government is always the safest place to save money in a country like the UK. And that's for one very simple, straightforward reason. The government always repay its debts. It is the one and only organisation that can do that. And as a consequence, large companies, banks, pension funds and others are very keen to save using government bonds because that is the one asset that they can rely upon to always be repaid when nothing else is guaranteed in that way including, in their case, any deposits that they might hold at a bank, because only the first £85,000 of the sums that they hold on deposit are guaranteed, which in the case of many of these organisations will be a totally insignificant amount. Therefore, the government can and very often does provide this facility, but it has to be understood for what it is. It's a savings facility. It is not in any shape or form a borrowing facility, because it doesn't need to borrow from these organisations. It is providing them with a safe place to save. So, where are we? We have a government which is in the position to control inflation without the use of interest rates. We can instead use tax rates to control inflation, or we can vary the scale of the deficit because that stimulates or reduces the scale of economic activity, which in turn has a consequence for the level of inflation within it. And the government could also, if it wished, use credit controls to commercial bank lending to control inflation. But MMT does describe a situation where if inflation is a priority, and inflation management is always a matter of concern in macroeconomic thinking, then this can be delivered without the use of interest rates, because MMT suggests that it would be wise to run a low effective interest rate policy within any economy. There are a number of reasons for doing so. Firstly, that of course minimises the interest rate obligations that the government will incur by providing a savings facility to whoever uses its banking facilities. In other words, the interest paid on government bonds or on national savings and investments accounts will be reduced to the minimum possible, which the government would appreciate. Secondly, of course, to provide a low interest policy provides the best possible environment for investment, because investment is not funded by savings, it is funded by borrowing, and if borrowing is cheap, the amount of money that will be invested in productive capital within an economy will rise, and the result is that we will get growth if that is the government's objective. So whether growth is the objective or not, low interest rate policies still pay. And third, having a policy which minimises the interest rate paid within an economy reduces the amount of money that is reallocated upwards by the payment of interest on things like mortgages, and that reduces inequality, which must be a government goal in any sensible environment where an economic balance is sought as an outcome from macroeconomic policy. All of this then means that a government can have one other objective, and that is full employment. This is possible inside an MMT environment, because what a government that is planning for inflation can do, which any government that is subscribing to MMT will be doing, will be to say that if there are underused resources within its economy, it can seek to put those resources to use without the risk of inflation arising. So if, for example, there are people who are underemployed or unemployed in the country, a government can pursue full employment, which would put those people to work in a way that could not create inflation because they are at present sitting out of work. Putting them to work cannot create inflation. But this policy, if properly understood within the context of MMT, is limited. It means that if there is no capacity to put extra resources to work and the government still tries to spend, it cannot achieve that objective unless one of two things happens. One would be inflation, because it would bid up the price of labour or other assets, or alternatively it must increase taxation. Now, it doesn't increase taxation in that situation to actually raise revenue, and that is an incredibly important point to make. What it does do is increase taxation to make sure that these resources are not going to be bid for in the private sector because the state wants to use them in the public sector. And this, as a matter of fact, is another use for taxation. It effectively removes resources from use within the private sector so that the state may buy them at a reasonable price. And that is part of macroeconomic management, because we know that the state and the private sector must work together to achieve all economic outputs, and therefore this balancing is essential. But it is a balancing act that has to be carefully planned to make sure that inflation does not result. There could be a guarantee of full employment within an MMT economy, I am not wholly convinced that is necessary, nor do I see it as a necessary balancing act to say everybody must have work if they want it. I think that that is a desirable outcome. I don't see it as an essential outcome. I will differ with some MMT economists on that point. They call this a job guarantee. I think it is something that a government may wish to do as a policy objective. I do not see it as core to MMT. Every single other thing that I have described within this video is, however, I think, core to MMT. Now, I am well aware that this has been quite a long and quite complicated video. There is a whole written version of this available as well, and we will provide the link below this video so you can download it from the Funding the Future website, because I have addressed this issue in several ways over quite a long period of time. But understanding MMT is really important if you are to get your head around the way in which the macro economy really works. There is nothing that I have said that is either particularly radical or unusual or even challengeable. In other words, this is the way that central banks agree that money works within the economy. This is the way that every economist of any repute now agrees that money is created. This is a way in which everybody knows inflation can be managed. It does challenge the idea of independent central banks and their control of inflation using interest rates, but that apart, MMT does very little which is radical or different or unusual. It is simply a form of post-Keynesian economics that says that with careful management of money, we can achieve the goal that any economy should try to fulfill. That is full employment. If ensuring that the well-being of people is delivered by guaranteeing them work to the greatest possible degree that a government can, and that becomes the aim of any government, then MMT makes sense for it to follow. If you want to run an economy without guaranteeing full employment, by all means, run the central bank using interest rates to control inflation and take the risk that there will always be unemployment as a buffer whilst it overheats or underheats the economy through the use of interest rate policy. But if people come first, so does MMT, and that is why it is so important.